We're all family here. Jesus calls us into the church where we are adopted as children of God and we are given an inheritance. Now, doesn't that sound nice? While we may have different abilities and different assignments here within the church, we all receive an eternal inheritance. We're all blessed by God. But as it is in our earthly families, there are things that we're to do together in the church and things that we need to be doing with God individually. We're to experience God corporately and individually. We can't just experience God one way or the other. Both are necessary for us to really, truly appreciate the abundant life that we can have in Jesus Christ. Never think that you can be a Christian without the church. But always remember that the life of faith also requires us to spend time alone with God. Even Jesus had to get away and be by himself to pray. Our psalm this morning shows both sides of the life of faith. We're looking at the 66th Psalm, one that begins with a processional call to worship, followed by an individual response. In the initial call, we're reminded of what God has done in history. In response, the shift is from the community's praise to an individual's act of praise for something that he experienced personally. God had answered the psalmist's prayer. Now, we're not told what problems the psalmist faced, only that God helped him get through it. Therefore, like Psalm 116, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the psalmist now responds to God by paying his vow. He offers sacrifices and praise to the Lord. Now, there's some that would like to separate this psalm into two parts. And you can see this division in the lectionary, which only uses the second half of the psalm. However, I don't agree. I think it all goes together. Yes, there are two main parts to the psalm, but they're connected. Our faith has a community aspect to it as well as a personal one. And we see both in this passage. With the community, the psalmist and us are called into worship. Then our faith should be such that not only do we give God thanks for the blessings that we've experienced in history, but also for the blessings that we have personally experienced from the Lord. As you listen to the psalm, feel how the people are called into God's presence, and then how, as an individual, the psalmist steps forward to offer thanks. Psalm 66. So listen for God's word to us this morning. Make a joyful noise to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of his name. Give to him glorious praise. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. Because of your great power, your enemies cringe before you. All the earth worships you. They sing praises to you. Sing praises to your name. Come and see what God has done. He is awesome in his deeds among mortals. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the river on foot. There we rejoiced in him, who rules by his might forever, whose eyes keep watch on the nations. Let the rebellious not exalt themselves. Bless our God, O people. Let the sound of his praise be heard, who has kept us among the living, for he has not let our feet slip. For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried. You brought us into the net. You laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, yet you have brought us out to a spacious place. I will come into your house with burnt offerings. I will pay you my vows, those that my lips utter and my mouth promised when I was in trouble. I will offer you burnt offerings of fatlings, with smoke of the sacrifice of rams. I will make an offering of bulls and goats. Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell what he has done for me. I cried aloud to him, and he was extolled with my tongue. If I had cherished iniquity in my hearts, the Lord would not have listened. But truly, God has listened. He has given heed to the words of my prayer. Blessed be God, because he has not rejected my prayer or removed his steadfast love from me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Growing up, my mother managed Sunday mornings. She'd get up early, I think even before my dad, unless he had to be away for work. And she'd fix a big breakfast, eggs, grits, bacon, toast, coffee. Or maybe it'd be pancakes stuffed with slices of bananas or with blueberries, although I think Dad generally cooked them. I can assure you, though, there was no better way to wake up than to the smell of frying bacon and perking coffee. When breakfast was almost ready, she'd wake us kids, and it kind of there started the countdown for Sunday morning when we had to be ready to leave. We would eat breakfast generally while watching some off-key gospel singers who seemed to be ubiquitous on television on Sunday mornings of my childhood in the South. At least after listening to them, I could never complain about music in church. After breakfast, we dressed, grabbed our Bibles, and we ran out the door to make it to Sunday school on time. I'm sure many of us credit our moms for making sure that we attended church growing up. Of course, my dad was also there, but then there were those Sundays that he had to work because, well, that was when he could inspect boilers that had been cooling down over the weekend before they started back on their work for Monday morning. So there were those Sundays my mom had to be totally in charge because my dad wasn't there. And she would get us to church on time, or certainly close to it. So happy Mother's Day to all moms who stepped in to help their children grow in the faith. We're in debt to our mothers and for those women who also stepped up to help other children grow in their faith. And we need people like that in our world to make sure that everyone has a chance to hear about Jesus. Now, Psalm 66 begins with a procession. As we saw in our call to worship this morning, there are kind of three parts to this gathering of people. We're called to join in the joyful noise, just like Psalm 100, praising God as we're led to the temple for worship. The first 4 verses all focus on this praise to God. Such praise exists not just in the people's cries, but in all the world. I'm reminded of Jesus telling his critics who complained of the ruckus his followers made when he entered into Jerusalem, saying that if they weren't crying out, that the stones would cry out. God has created the world, and God created the world to reflect his own creativity and to praise his glory. Now, if you followed along in the Bible, you may have noticed a Selah, which I didn't read, that's in the margin after the 4th verse. Now, no one's really sure what this word means. Some thinks it has something to do with the type of music that accompanied the Psalms. Perhaps it was a clash of a cymbal or something like that, and that may be. But here it also marks the end of the first part of the gathering. As I said, there are 3 parts to this gathering. After praising God, it is time now to invite others to join the crowd. So in verse 5, we have the first of 2 invitations. Come and see what God has done. The psalmist then recalls the great events of the Exodus, that is, the parting of the sea, and the great events of the conquest, the crossing of the Jordan. These were events which the Hebrew people were familiar. But God is not just the God of the Hebrew people. God rules the nations, and at the end of verse 7 reminds us that God is not going to let the proud get too big for their britches by not letting the rebellious exalt themselves. Then we come to another Selah in the margins as we move to the 3rd part of the opening. This 3rd section again issues a call for the praise of God who has kept us among the living. Now think about that. God keeping us among the living. Without God, there would be no life. And then we're reminded that God keeps our feet from slipping. God is our lamp and a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, as the 119th Psalm proclaims. But this 3rd section also acknowledges that life is not always rosy. God places burdens on us. We are tested. People take advantage of us. Yet God brings us through those kinds of troubles. The second major section of the psalm begins with verse 12. And we see this section because there's a shift in the way language is used. No longer is the focus on the plural, on the community. Now it's an individual that takes center stage. The psalmist comes to God's house to pay his vows, which he had made to God when he was in trouble. Now let me say a little bit about vows, because we have to be careful with them. We should not make vows as a way to manipulate God. There is a horrible story in the book of Judges about Jephthah, an Israelite warrior, who vowed that if God would give him victory in battle, that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his door when he returned home. He would offer that up as a sacrifice to God. And when he returned home, his own daughter ran out the door to greet him. Vows made for the wrong reasons can be dangerous. John Calvin taught that the only purpose of our vow is to show gratitude to God. That appears to be the intent here with the psalmist. And as a result of what God has done for the psalmist now feels he needs to repay this vow. But a mini lesson here is this: don't try to force God to act to your benefit. Because God is not solely on our side. In fact, we don't even want to ask God to be on our side. Instead, what we need to make sure that we do is to make sure that we are on God's side. After testifying to how his actions show gratitude to God, the psalmist then issues his own call. The community called people to come, and the community had already called people to come and see. Now the individual calls them to come and to hear what God has done. He tells his story of how he cried out to God in need, and God listened, and God answered. And because of God hearing and God acting, he now praises the Almighty. He blesses God for God's faithfulness. This psalm shows a movement from the community to the personal. And it could also go the other way, from the personal or the individual to the community. For both aspects of our faith are important. The community helps us to know God and how God has acted in history and in the past. But when we experience God's action in our own lives, it's firsthand. And then we're called to be the ones to give thanks. What this psalm also demonstrates is that for the individual and the community, the call needs to be issued for people to witness what God has done and is doing. If we don't witness to the God of the Bible, who is also God not only of those past events, but God who is acting in our lives, if we don't witness to how God is acting in our lives, how will people know what God is capable of doing? So how has God acted in your life? Thankfully, many of us have had mothers that have guided us. They're one way God has acted in our lives. Others of us have been blessed in sharing the good news with friends, with business associates, and with others who have passed by or crossed our lives. As it is with the psalm, we should be praising God and giving thanks for the blessings that we have received today and always. Amen.